So yes, we are back in the games room, and it's about that time for some pickups, stuff that I got from Japan. And to be honest with you, some of the stuff I've had for quite a while, a couple of months now, and the backlog is stacking up. So I thought I'd show off the Sega games first, a bit of SG-1000, some Megadrive and some Saturn. Just ignore that wonderful bit of Capcom there. That's a bit of a spoiler for the arcade pickups. But I will do another pickups video as well for some of the Nintendo stuff, and I have some PC Engine games of course to show you, but that will come later. For now, let's focus on that stack of games there on the table. Let's take a look at what I picked up. Let's start off with the Sega 1000 and the Black Onyx. So I'm slowly trying to pick up all the Sega 1000 my cards, so I was well stoked to manage to finally pick this one up. It's not one you see often, yeah, it's pretty cool to actually get this one. I thought for the cover it may be like an arcade game, but it's not. In fact, it's a RPG game. It's very primitive, and apparently it's one of the first Japanese RPGs. But saying that, it wasn't actually developed by a Japanese company. It was developed by a Dutch guy, I think. And it's basically just a sort of dungeon, sort of crawling basic RPG. You sort of create a party and you go around battling and getting others to join. And funny enough, the actual language is in English, even though it was only released in Japan. But they did have other versions that came out on the Game Boy Color, and I think the Famicom too. Next up is Champion Boxing. Now this is a very early game. We're talking about 84, 85. So it's very basic indeed. There's not much to it at all. There's not even multiple opponents to fight either. So it's basically you selecting the CPU, or you can obviously pay a second player as well, but you just select the difficulty and then you kick off the fight. On low, it's very easy to defeat the CPU, and on high, it's almost impossible. There's not many moves. There's a couple of jabs and uppercuts. Not much to this game at all, but it is nice to see a bit of Pengo make an appearance in there on the ring. Don't really recommend it, but it's one that if you go for the collection, the MyCon collection, you've got to get. We've got another very basic sports game. It is Champion Golf. Now this is an extremely painful game to play. The controls are an absolute nightmare. You sort of select your direction by a little dude running around the outside of the golf course with a little flag. And of course you can change your club as a normal golf game, but I never got the hang of the power. I couldn't quite work it out. I was expecting it to be where you are in your swing would give you the right amount of power, but it didn't seem to play out that way. It seemed a little bit random. So I got a little bit fed up with this game very quickly, but again, I'm going for the set of my cards, so I had to get this one, and it is very cheap and very common game to pick up. So, but I wouldn't recommend it to play. It's yeah, very frustrating. Next up is Champion Billiards. Now you're probably expecting me to say this is another dud. We have got the word champion and we've got a sports game, but no, this is quite a different story. I really wanted to get this one, not only because it's my card, but it was actually developed by Compile, and they did an absolute fantastic job with this one. The actual mechanics and the ball physics and the physics of the table as well, because they do change it up quite a bit. Absolutely fantastic job. I had a lot of fun playing this one, a lot more fun than I would actually imagine for a billiards game. And it's more of a cross between sort of pool and I guess something like miniature golf, as in the courses are quite random and lots of obstacles and sort of elevated areas to make it more difficult for you. I definitely recommend you try this one out, but of course it's an old game. It doesn't hold out to a lot of later games, but if you like your 8-bit stuff, give it a go. Next up is Borderline. Now this is actually an arcade port. Not a game I'm familiar with. I've never seen an arcade cab of this or never really heard about this game, but it's kind of a strange one. It's sort of a cross between a shooter and Dig Dug of all things. So the reason why I wanted to get this one is because it's not even a my card, it's actually an SG-1000 just straight up cart, is because it was also developed by Compile. Now I'm not sure if they had any involvement with the actual arcade version of it, or if they just did the port, but certainly before they became Compile, they were involved developing this game. And the first stage is a bit of a nightmare. The actual shooting stage is not particularly well done, but the later stages, which is more like a sort of dig dug game, they actually come into their own. They're kind of fun. But again, these are very old games. We're talking about 83, so unless you like your old 8 bits or even before, you're not going to enjoy this one. The final game of the Sega My Cards, and also the pick of the bunch, is Gull Cave. So this is another game by Compile, and it's a horizontal shooter too. They didn't do too many horizontal shooters, to be honest with you. Mostly they were vertical. And it's certainly a very sort of quirky shooter, to say the least. What I mean by quirky, well, it's the power-up is pretty random. So I couldn't work it out at the beginning, but I sort of figured it out. The long bar on the bottom of the screen sort of shifts by the sort of number of the sort of pickup box that you get, but you have no idea what weapon it's going to be, but it does increase your health. So it's kind of a risk-reward thing. You know, you do want to pick up these upgrades because you do want to get additional health, because believe me, you're going to get whacked by all sorts of things. But at the same time, you could be getting a lot worse weapon, or you could get a better one. So it is a fun game, but again, it's a very basic shooter, but it's nice to have a bit of the Compile history and another my card. So let's move on to the Megadrive and Rambo 3. So yeah, this came out in all regions, and a very common game, but finally picked it up. I had this one back in the day. I used to have an import Megadrive, so it's good to get this version back and to play a little bit of Rambo 3. So I used to play the hell out of this one. I used to love it to bits, and I've got to say, after playing it for the first time after God knows how many years, it's not aged as well as I thought it was going to, but still is a little bit of fun. It's actually based off an arcade game. I don't know how close it is to the Taito original Rambo 3. Well, if it's a remake or if it's a port. I've never even played the arcade game, even though I actually own the PCB. It's actually at my mum's place, so I've never actually got it. I've had it for about 7 years now. I've still not managed to get it from the UK. It's probably lost by now, to be honest with you. She probably sold it. Someone's probably picked it up on eBay. But there you go. Maybe one day I'll get to play the original arcade game of this. I think everybody with a Megadrive has played this one at some point. It's just basically a commando, but less linear. And there's some sort of extras to it as well. Of course, you've got that amazing crossbow for your explosives. And those sort of mini games as well with the crossbow is quite cool. Next up is Fire Mustang by Taito. Now this is a game that didn't come out in any other region. I think this is a Japan exclusive, and it was an arcade game, but not a Taito arcade game. It was by NMK, who did quite a lot of shooters in the arcade. They did stuff like the P-47 games. I think they did Saint Dragon and even Zed-Blade as well for the Neo Geo. It's definitely not one of the best shooters on the system, but it's okay. I would say it's kind of an average shooter. You've got your sort of basic upgrades to you know, multi-direction shot and what have you. But yeah, the graphics aren't fantastic. I guess it's a fairly early game, and there's not much variation in the gameplay too. But yeah, it seems to play reasonably well, and the sounds aren't too awful. Yeah, it's just an average shooter, nothing really to write home about. but I am after as many of the shooters on the Mega Drive as possible, so yeah, I decided to pick it up. It's not too expensive. Next up is Divine Ceiling. So this is a sort of kind of unofficial game. I think it was only released in Japan and maybe in places like Korea as well. And you don't really see this one around that much. Most of them are like kind of bootlegs, I guess. To actually see it with the original packaging was kind of cool, so I thought I'd pick it up. I heard it's not particularly good, and what they say is true. It is awful. It's a terrible, terrible game. But it's more famous or infamous because I believe there's cutscenes, you know, a little bit risque or whatever. But you know, if you want to get to those scenes, you have to play the game, and the game is not worth playing to get that far. Whatever you're going to see, you don't want to go through the gameplay, the mess of a game that it is, the frustration of playing this game to be rewarded with whatever you're going to be rewarded with, because it's not worth it. It really isn't. But it's quite cool to get it. Like I mentioned before, I'm trying to get all the shooters, so I thought I'd get this one. The last Mega Drive game is Captain Lang. This, of course, was released in the West. It was High Seas Havoc on the Genesis. I'm not sure what it was called on PAL territories. I think it maybe was just called Havoc. It's kind of a fun game. It's Data East's attempt of doing a sort of a Sonic game. I believe they also brought out the game in the arcades, but it was basically the Mega Drive version that they took and released in the arcades. I've been after this game for quite a few years now, but to be honest with you, I was looking for the Genesis version. I wasn't really aware of the Japanese version of this game, and I've been watching it go up and up in price, and yeah, I missed the boat on that. And when I saw it come up for Yahoo Auction, I thought, you know, let's see what it's going for, and it goes for a fraction of the price that it's going for the Genesis. So definitely the Japanese version is the way to go. So let's move on to the glorious Saturn. We got Salamander Deluxe Pack Plus. This is one game that I thought I had, but it wasn't until I was doing the high score challenge recently for Salamander 2 that I realized that I don't actually have this one, and it is an absolute must. This collection pack of Salamander 1, Life Force and Salamander 2 is an absolute must if you have a Saturn. Not particularly that expensive, easy to find, but you should have this in your collection. And believe me, this is absolutely perfect to the arcade. I was hoping it wasn't going to be. This is the first time that I was hoping that the port was going to be easier or slightly different, because we were having high score challenge, and I was playing the original arcade version of this, and I was getting absolutely wasted by Dylan and Eddie Rollercore, and I was hoping I'd get this one and tally up my score, but no, it's identical to the arcade game, and those guys destroyed me in that challenge. Next up is a Technisoft game with the word hyper in it. No, it's not Hyper Duel, it is Hyper Rathiathon. This is a Japan exclusive, and no one really talks about this one, and probably for good reason. It's not actually that good, but it's definitely worth checking out. It's something a little bit different by Technisoft. It's sort of like a battle arena game, and really nicely laid out, as in the graphics are not too bad for the day. It is 3D graphics, which normally I don't go for, but all the cutscenes and the sort of character designs, all very well done, but it's just the gameplay itself, it's just a little bit simple. And yeah, the first couple of bosses, or not bosses, but opponents that you play, it's pretty easy. It's a pretty dull game, but almost a good game. It just feels unfinished. If they could add a little bit more to it, it could have been a very good game. Next up, we have another shooter. It is Bokan Ipatsu. I did cover this one recently on the PlayStation 1. There's actually two on the PlayStation 1 that are shooters on the series. I'm still missing one. I keep on trying to get the second one, and I keep on failing. I wasn't quite sure which version this was on the Saturn, but it is the same one that I have on the PlayStation 1. But I do feel it does seem a little bit better on the Saturn than the PlayStation 1. So I probably will be keeping this one. I do prefer the Saturn over the PlayStation 1 for these shooters. So I'll probably keep this one and sell off the PlayStation 1 game. If you don't know this one already, it is a sort of quirky, very colourful shooter. You get to select from the beginning of the game which vehicle you're going to use, so that defines what levels you're going to play. And the levels are quite nicely varied. You've got like underwater levels, you've got desert, jungle levels. Nice, interesting bosses to fight. And yeah, it's a really fun game. I definitely recommend this one. It's also fairly easy as well, so it's a very accessible shooter. The emphasis is really on the fun, so definitely recommend it. Last but not least, we have got Batman Forever, the arcade game. This came out on the Sega STV hardware, but it's a little bit of a different one. It's not like the normal carts that you get for the system, so I don't actually have this one. It was a sort of standalone PCB with a sort of CD attachment to it. Not an easy one to find, so I gave up looking for this one a long time ago. So I thought I'd definitely get the Saturn version of it. And even if you get the Sega STV multi-cart, because the music's on the CD disc, you won't get the full experience. This was released in all regions, but it is a pricey one in North America, and I think also PAL as well. So definitely the Japanese version is the way to go if you want to pick up this game. And believe me, you will want to if you love your brawlers. This is a hell of a lot of fun. It's really over the top action. You know, you've got so many power-ups and so many enemies to fight. It's just mad. So much fun. I definitely recommend this one. So there you have it. That's all the Sega games that I picked up. And I will be doing some other pickups videos as I normally do. There will be an arcades pickups video, so you'll see more of that sort of Capcom tank thing on the table there. And as I mentioned before, I'll do a Nintendo and PC Engine pickups video as well. Hopefully you found something useful in there, something you might want to pick up or maybe avoid. So I'll be thanking you, and I'll be seeing you later.